Some of these clowns on social media prey on people with these cookie cutter diet plans that don't understand how destructive it can be for a person, both mentally and physically. I mean, no question, that person will no doubt lose weight. But the main question is it the correct way of doing it? Are they losing body fat and gaining and maintaining muscle? That's the big question. Or are they losing weight by releasing a lot of water retention? Okay? Or are they losing muscle? Or are they losing fat? It's still weight loss, right? But that is if you're measuring it by the weight scale. But in a physique show for both men and women, they're judged on their musculature and aesthetics. So holding on to as much muscle as possible is very critical. Let's just imagine that again, that same person got back on the same cookie cutter diet plan and they go back to the way they were eating before, but this time they have less muscle. And as a result, they'll have a slower metabolism, which is easier to get fat. And this is pretty common to people who compete, and after the show is over, they binge eat. They are now reintroducing that childhood love and affection foods that they've been missing out for the last 12 to 20 weeks out. And food is much like a drug, like heroin, cigarette smoking, that it's just crazy. It's so euphoric that no matter how much food they consume, their brain will not stop sending them the signal to stop eating, because the brain wants to protect you and will want to fatten you up in case you put it through that same stressors again. It's preparing itself. It hates to be deprived. So have you ever heard of rebounding? Some of these competitors, or even people who lost a lot of weight in a short period of time, will go on this food binge for days, maybe weeks. And I've seen competitors gain up to 20, 30 pounds in a week. So it's really not the preparation going to the contest that I question. It's the lack of preparation on how to deal with the aftermath of a competition. And that's where these online gurus tend to fail. They should also be concerned about your health, not about your pocketbook. So be careful. There's opportunists out there, I call them vultures, and they just want your money. So do your homework, folks. Don't let a picture of someone with a six-pack on a picture of themselves, fool you and with false hopes and promises. So don't get sold. Get educated. So it's not more about weight loss. It's more about body fat percentage. And there's two reasons why we're overweight or we're fat. One reason for being overweight or fat is lack of knowledge. Not knowing what to do, when to do it, what to eat, how much, and when. Because we haven't learned it. It's never been really taught to us. So when I consult with my new clients and they learn more about nutrition, they get amazing results pretty quickly. I had a client in a week drop about 15 pounds of fat, but of course he weighed 330 pounds to begin with. I had another client, a young lady who weighed about 130 pounds, and she lost 5 pounds of fat in a week. So it's really more about the body fat percentage and not about a number on a weight scale. And I'll explain more in a bit. There's another reason. There's a psychological reason. How many of you have a food compulsion or a food addiction? So a food compulsion or a food addiction is when, if there's a food that I put in front of you and you can't say no to, no matter how much you've eaten already, you cannot stop eating it. And there's actually a reason for that. When we look at our brain has two hemispheres. We have the right and we have the left hemisphere. And each hemisphere has something called the amygdala. In Latin, it means almond. So it's the size of an almond, and its job is to monitor the entire body except for itself. So what happens is whenever we have an experience, each amygdala on each side of our hemispheres in our brain makes an image or a picture. The right hemisphere is more in charge of the artistic and creative side of our brain. It functions like emotions, imagination, intuition, music, and the left hemisphere is in charge of logical, analytical, reasoning, math and science, language. So the right hemisphere is kind of like your emotions and feelings and so on, and the left hemisphere is I call information in, information out. So if you would imagine, it's my 8th birthday, and at my birthday, you guys are all invited. So I'm surrounded by friends and loved ones. So in my right hemisphere, I'm experiencing friendship, love, and connection. And then my parents come out with chocolate cake. So the left hemisphere goes, chocolate cake is friendship, love, connection. So when I'm older, like 30, and I'm feeling lonely and I want friendship, love, and connection, I eat chocolate cake. and I can eat all the chocolate cake in the world. Unfortunately, I'll never experience those feelings, but my brain is linked up or hooked up for that. And that's the whole idea. When I teach nutrition, it's not depriving yourself, but finding out what you really need and what's necessary for you to function optimally and efficiently. And being that most of the people that are probably watching this video are more likely into fitness, I'll explain how we can eat so that we can have better results, better fuel, and take better care of our bodies. Because believe it or not, exercise creates free radicals, and free radicals are in charge of breaking down cells to steal electrons. And once you start to do breaking down continually, we want to be able to repair those cells or prevent that as much as possible. So when we look at food, food consists of 3 macronutrients, and those are proteins, fats, and carbs. And these help supply energy for the body. With all these diets out there, there are these online gurus that can't explain simply what a protein or carbohydrate is. Let me make it easy and possible to understand. So you don't exactly need a biochemistry degree to know this. So speaking of degree, I got my bachelor's science degree from Purdue University, go Boilers, and a minor in nutrition in 1998. And before college, I worked at GNC in my hometown for a few years, and I was really into working out in high school for sports, and working at GNC at the time seemed like a great idea. The first day I was captivated, and after college I immediately started working for a sports nutrition company back in California, and still to this day I'm still in the industry, but at Max Muscle. I've competed in bodybuilding, drug-free shows, judge shows, but the really passion of mine is to help people with nutrition and supplementation. So all right, so let's move on, shall we? So let's begin and explain what's a protein. If it has a face, it's a protein. If it ran, swam, or flew on this earth, it's a protein. And if it grows from the ground, it's a carbohydrate. Tough so far. Follow me. Now when it comes to fats, fats are really important. And they can either come from an animal source or a vegetable source like almonds, avocados, olive oil, and other good healthy fats. And those animal fats I just mentioned, like bacon and butter and lard and grease, those are the ones we want to try to kind of avoid. So in our diet, we need around 15 to 30% of our total calories coming from fat. This drawing right here is an illustration of a human cell, and we have anywhere between 30 to 40 million cells on average, and every single cell is wrapped in fat called a phospholipid bilayer. And inside these cells, well, let me mention, we do need some fat to be able to make more cells, because if we can't make more cells, it's called aging. And most of us don't want to age prematurely. So a really low fat diet can prevent you in regeneration of your cells, because we're tearing down muscle almost daily, and we need to repair them, so we need to create more cells. Follow me? So what's interesting, inside of this cell membrane, we have these things called receptors. And receptors are kind of like locks on our doors. They allow certain things to go in our cells, and they allow certain things to go out of our cells. And so whenever we look at carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, again, when we eat them, they don't go right into our cells. They first go right into our stomach. They sit there long enough to get digested. The process of digestion is taking a solid and turning it into a liquid. So our stomach is basically like a blender. And once that food is blended, it leaves our stomach, goes into your intestines, and finally gets absorbed into our bloodstream through a hepatic pathway. Examples of carbs are like oatmeal, vegetables, potato chips. So to rephrase, we eat these carbs, it doesn't go to our muscle cells, goes to your stomach, sit there long enough to get it digested. Once they're turned into liquid, they leave your stomach, they go into your intestines, and they get absorbed into the bloodstream in the form of glucose or blood sugar. Have any of you heard anyone say, I have high blood sugar, or my blood glucose levels are high or low? So there's a high and there's a low. So what's normal? So normal blood glucose levels is anywhere between 80 and 120. And glucose levels in our blood is measured in milligrams per deciliter, which means how much sugar, milligrams, is in how many deciliters, or how much fluid, or how much amount of blood. And our blood is a lot like water. And if I take this water bottle and I start adding sugar or molasses or syrup in it, it gets really thick. And thick blood doesn't circulate really well. And what's really going to happen, your sugars levels will rise as we eat carbohydrates. They get digested and they go to our bloodstream. They go to a certain point, and once they hit a certain point, it's going to get really thick and it can't circulate. And then our body secretes a hormone called insulin. Insulin is the key that binds to every one of these little cells and shoots all this blood glucose in a form of glycogen. And all that glycogen is a whole bunch of glucose hooked together. And this is basically stored energy. So if glucose is sticky, glycogen is so much more sticky than glucose, and it's so concentrated that for every 1 molecule of glycogen, we pull in 3 times as much water inside the cell. So this bottle right here, this bottle right here is a pint of water, and a pint weighs a pound. So if I weighed myself right now and I drank this bottle of water, then I weighed myself again later, I'm a pound heavier. Am I fatter? No, I'm just less thirsty. So I don't care what the number on the scale in terms of measuring your progress. What really matters is how much room you take up in your clothes or your belt or the mirror. Follow? So somewhere here in my virtual world, I have 5 pounds of muscle and 5 pounds of fat, and it's obviously the same weight. So which 5 pounds would you rather have? So whatever you weigh right now, I give you this muscle, it's 5 pounds more. Would you be fatter? No. What if I took one of these away, 5 pounds of fat, and you weigh 5 pounds less? Then I give you 2 pounds of these, 5 pounds of muscle, you weigh 5 pounds more, so you'd be heavier. So we don't really care how much you weigh, and neither should you. What you should really care is how much room you take up. Or another way of saying it, it's called your body fat percentage. And so, well, let me talk about body fat percentage. And there's different ways in measuring body fat percentage. My favorite and what we use at the store is calipers. And calipers actually pinch your skin, and depending on how thick your skin is, that tells me how much body fat you have. The thicker your skin, the more fat. And you've seen those handheld devices. And those are okay and decent to use for a super quick reading. And the way they work, those things is, remember how I said that when you eat carbohydrates, blood glucose levels goes in there and stored as glycogen, and then you pull in water? Well, water conducts electricity. So if I punch in this little machine how much I weigh and how tall I am, it knows how much mass I'm made of. Then now I hold that handheld device, or maybe the one you can stand on like this one, it shoots real light ohms of electricity, which means calculating the distance between 2 points from one arm down across to the other arm, or one leg to the other. And there's a little computer in there that times to see how long it takes to go from one side to the other. So the more water I have, the faster the electricity is going to travel. So the leaner I will be, according to this machine. Again, this is a quick generalization calculation because there's a few factors that can alter a body fat reading from any of those devices I just mentioned. So let's just imagine if I drank, for example, wine at night and then coffee in the morning, which both tend to dehydrate you a bit. So if I'm dehydrated, both devices are going to give me a higher body fat reading than what it should be. And then after drinking a gallon of water a day, which I traditionally do, I go home, I remeasure, and damn, my body fat is lower. So, and considering that I'm a male, my fluid levels don't fluctuate as much as females do. So if I had a female client and I happen to use this and it's close to her menstrual cycle, they tend to be higher or might be lower. Okay, so same thing, if you just flew on an airplane somewhere, flying makes you a little bit dehydrated. So that can too also be not so accurate reading. So these are really good if we have a really stabilized meal plan and we're consistent with our hydration status and so on. But let's face it, when you exercise, you sweat, you perspire. So if I were to measure your body fat afterwards, you'll probably be a little more fatter than if you did before. Now with calipers, I like using them, and there's about 20 different formulas you can use. So when we do body fat measurements, I do a 3-point measurement. Men, it's chest, abs, and thigh. For women, it's tricep, suprailiac, and thigh as well. When testing for a client that's doing a bodybuilding show, I do a 7-point measurement called the Jackson-Pollock method, because the more points to pinch, I'll have a more accurate measurement of their body fat leading up to their competition. Another reason I like using calipers, an example, if my client was a woman, I measure her tricep her iliac crest and her thigh 1 week, and then the next week after I measure again the same, and her iliac crest and her thigh went down, but her tricep went up. Well, have you ever noticed when you burn your finger on a stove, you get this little welt on the top and it looks swollen? Well, when you're working out with weights, you're tearing down muscle tissue. So when your body covers it with fluid to repair that tissue, and that usually takes about 24 to 72 hours from the time you work out. So if I did chest really hard today, for the next 2 to 3 days, I'll be a little tender and puffy. So if I measure my client's triceps and they're higher, but her waist and her thigh is lower, we don't gain fat in our arms and lose it everywhere else. We tend to gain it evenly and lose it evenly. So I probably know that she trained arms or chest, because you also use your triceps when you train chest, the last 24 to 72 hours. So, and if her thigh was higher and her waist and triceps are lower, well, she probably did legs within 24 to 72 hours. Now, if her waist was higher and it's a female, it could be that she's starting her menstrual cycle or that she's retaining sodium. Perhaps maybe a dinner from a restaurant from the night before. And if it's a male, more likely he's just retaining sodium. He probably just ate too much salt. So this machine gives me a little bit more idea on what's going on with my clients, where, you know, this one's a quick one measurement to use. This one right here, I mean, it's kind of like what they're doing. They're just okay machines. So if you want something quick, again, they're not the most accurate, but it's quick. And these are all just estimations. To really know what your body fat is, there's a body scan called DEXA, and DEXA will scan your whole body, which tells us your body fat, your skin thickness, your bone thickness, how much fat you really have, how much muscle mass you have, and so on. It's really not cheap. I think the last time I checked was about from $130 to about up to $400 to have it done. And there's also hydrostatic weighing, or that underwater dunk tank, where you can get measured while you're underwater, and that can be around $50 to $100. But I don't expect you to spend that much money for the test. What I really want to do with my clients is to establish a consistent trend. And I don't care how much fat you truly have. I just want to see if you're dropping fat and gaining or maintaining lean muscle over time. One final note. These calipers are only as good as the person who's doing the pinching. All right, so going back to my drawing board, let's refresh really quick. So again, when we eat carbs, they first go to our stomach, they get digested, leave our stomach, then it goes to our intestines, where it gets absorbed in the bloodstream called glucose, okay? And then glucose levels will go up, and then our body secretes a hormone called insulin, right? And insulin shoots all this glucose into our muscle cells, puts water in there, and the sugars that was in our blood is now stored. Now, in the end, our blood sugars levels drop. So anytime we're below 80 in 120, we're hungry again. So we wanted to know how long it took from the time we ate till the time we got hungry again. So there's a study called Gastric emptying time, which just means how long does it take food to leave your stomach. And there's a study called the Gastric emptying time, which just means how long does it take food to leave your stomach. And what was interesting is they found that carbohydrates tend to stay in your stomach, you know, for about 1 hour. For example, if you eat oatmeal for breakfast, from the time you have your oatmeal to the time your sugar levels drop, it's usually about, 30 to 45 minutes to an hour at tops. Protein, on the other hand, tends to stay in your stomach for about 2 hours, right? Fats, 3 to 5 hours. And what was interesting, but one thing that research found was really interesting, was when you combine a carbohydrate with a protein, okay? And most proteins have a little bit of fat, even though you're eating really lean chicken, there's still a little fat in there. So both the fat and the protein would keep your carbs in your stomach a little longer, slowing down gastric emptying time. And your sugar levels would just go up slowly, right? And then come down really slowly. Okay, so from the time you eat to the time you're hungry again is now 3.5 to 4 hours. So how many of you have heard I should be eating every 3 to 4 hours? Well, now you know why. And how come no author or Instagram diet guru never told you this? I'm just kidding. So to help you keep your muscle and get rid of your fat, I have 4 basic rules that are really easy to follow. So rule number 1, I want you to eat every 3 to 4 hours, whether you're hungry or not. Okay? So imagine if you're camping and you want to keep that campfire burning all day. Well, you're going to put that firewood, which is your food, into the fire, which is your metabolism, to keep that campfire burning all day, which is like another term called thermogenesis, which means the ability to produce heat in organisms. So food generates heat. There's also a term called thermogenic effects of food. So whenever we eat, our body temperature goes up, and to stay warm, we need a certain number of fat. So when I measure people and I notice if he or she is pretty lean, they're burning a lot of calories just trying to stay warm because they have no fat and they're typically cold all the time. Fat is an insulator. So that's another way of burning calories. So rule number 2 is possibly the most important rule, and as every time you eat a carbohydrate, you must eat it with a protein. Okay, as I just explained. There's one exception to this rule, and that's a post-workout shake. So let me elaborate. So when we exercise, what we're doing is taking this glycogen, remember the stored energy that's in there? Remember we have 1 molecule of glycogen to 3 parts water, and this glycogen gets taken out to make energy, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So when we're exercising, we secrete 5 hormones: growth hormone, epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucagon, and cortisol. And these 5 hormones have a specific job, and that is to block insulin. Okay, so they can break down glucose so that we can use it in exercise. So when we take out all this glycogen out of our muscle cells after you work out, you'll wait about 15-20 minutes, and then you'll drink a post-workout shake. For example, something like our Max ARM, which is anabolic recovery matrix, solid. Let me go in more detail about a post-workout. So numerous research studies has shown an ideal post-workout shake, considering if you did a full body exhaustion workout, you would want around about 65-70 grams of carbohydrates, okay? And these have to be high glycemic, and I'll explain what high glycemic means shortly. You also want about 20 grams of protein, and now the type of protein, what we want in your shake is something that leaves your stomach right away, and there's different types of proteins, and they come out of your stomach really slowly as well. So the best protein I recommend is to use something like that is 100% hydrolyzed whey protein, because you want it to leave right away and get into your muscle cells to replenish and to start the recovery process. The one thing about hydrolyzed whey protein, I used to work for manufacturing, and it's just really rancid tasting, and it tastes horrible, and it's pretty much really expensive to make. That's why you don't really see many of these proteins in the marketplace. The alternative is to use, and it'll work just as well, is an isolate whey protein, for example, like so. We have chocolate, vanilla, strawberries, and we have fruity ones. I like this one. And then you want about 20 grams of branched chain amino acids, or BCAAs. And they're also great when you're exercising. You're actually breaking down muscle tissue and releasing branched chain amino acids. And you use those, the ketone bodies, for energy. So if you take BCAAs during your workouts, you reduce the risk of breaking down muscle tissue, and you actually get better recovery afterwards and better muscle growth. And so then you take about 5 to 10 grams of glutamine. Oh gosh, glutamine is one of the best amino acids out there. It does many things besides muscle recovery. It feeds your intestinal lining of your cells, which are called enterocytes. So your body can absorb food better. It's the highest concentration amino acid in the spinal cerebral fluid. So your nerves will work much better. You'll think more clearly. It helps maintain muscle once again. It's one of the things that it's one of the main things that I like about it is it helps to secrete more growth hormone, and growth hormone helps to preserve and regenerate cells for faster muscle growth. So glutamine is one of the coolest amino acids out there. Moving on, I also would include about 200 to 300 milligrams of ALA, or alpha lipoic acid. And again, ALA helps your body to secrete more insulin. And why do you want more insulin? It's the timing of it. because when you spike insulin, it's going to shove all this glucose and all the amino acids right back into your muscle cells and causing something called cell volumization. So it's going to make you bigger and full of water at the same time with all these nutrients. For example, your car runs a lot better when there's water in the radiator because it keeps the engine cool. Well, cell volumization or cell volumizing, we found that when your cells are bigger and full of water, all the reactions that take place in your cells at a cellular level usually act with water. So by having that water in there helps the cells work a lot more better or efficiently. Okay, so that's really key. You also want about 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C. It's a vitamin antioxidant. Remember, you just create a lot of stress and free radicals after working out. And also 1,000 milligrams of vitamin E as well. Let's see what else. You want about 10 grams of creatine. Now, this is optional because it really depends on what the type of athlete you are. Creatine. So if you're a bodybuilder, a weightlifter, powerlifter, or even let's say a boxer, for example, is somebody who needs to do something really quickly and fast speed, creatine is great, and it's one of the most researched supplements today with positive and effective results. Because what creatine does, it helps to regenerate quick energy like power, explosion, short bursts of energy. So when we look at energy, there's three types of energy. We have ATP phosphatidylcreatine energy system, which lasts about 10 seconds. Then you have the anaerobic glycolysis, which is burning sugar without any oxygen, which can last anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute at the most, maybe depending on how well-trained an athlete you are. And the third is aerobic glycolysis, which can last up to 4 hours. And aerobic just means exercise with oxygen. So when you're running a marathon and you're over here, you're just using fat and carbs for an extended period of time. So creatine does absolutely nothing for you. So in addition, when you're holding your breath for less than 10 seconds, like a 40-yard sprint, it's not going to do much for you either. But if you're over here in the weightlifting arena or boxing, for example, where you have around 10 seconds, like for example, how long does it take you to do like a set of weights? 8 to 10 seconds, right? So if you're taking creatine, you might get 6 to 8 reps, maybe 2 reps more. With those extra 2 reps, puts your muscles under more stress. So, but then you have to eat to be able to make that muscle bigger. So it's a process, it's a circular process. So creatine doesn't make you bigger, it just gives you the energy to perform better. So remember how I talked about ATP, adenosine triphosphate? Well, adenosine triphosphate gets broken down and it gives away a phosphate, and this phosphate is what we use for energy. So now that adenosine triphosphate has now become adenosine diphosphate, so this molecule gets recycled in what they call a Krebs cycle to get rephosphorylated or to have energy again. So what creatine monohydrate does is when it gets inside the cell, okay, it becomes creatine phosphate, and then it donates a phosphate to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, making it ATP again. So you have that recycled energy or that rep or that push or that sprint. So it repeats itself. So creatine is great if you're doing something that lasts for about 10 seconds, like a weight training session. You rest and then you perform it again, and so on. So this is very useful. Highly recommend. Okay, so if you're a marathon runner or a cyclist, creatine will, when it gets inside your cells, it just pulls in more water. Okay, and I see people gain about 10 to 15 pounds of water on creatine. So I've seen cyclists pay up to $5,000 for a bicycle that's about maybe 10 ounces lighter. So why would you put in 14 pounds of water and pay $5,000 for a bike that's lighter? It doesn't make no sense. So creatine doesn't work well for triathletes or marathon runners or cyclists unless you're maybe off season and would like to build up muscles for power and strength. And I'll also talk about high intensity exercise tends to break down muscle tissue in a minute. Okay, so supplement post-workout. So recap: after workout, take about 70 grams carbohydrates, 20 grams about protein from hydrolyzed whey protein or isolate protein 20 grams of branched chain amino acids, 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, vitamin E, and creatine optional if you want to build more muscle mass. And if you're an endurance athlete, do away with it. So it's kind of like when you get home from a long trip, your car is on empty, and you want to fill the tank up so you can go the next time. Okay, that's a post-workout. And again, Max Muscle Arm has all this included, so that's why I really encourage you to have this in your regime. Works really well, tastes really good too. And I've had customers that run marathons, CrossFitters completing a recent competition, clients that just did a Spartan race or something, and they usually can't move for about a week, and I had them do this, or what I just suggested, and about 2 to 3 days later, they're like, I'm ready to do another one. And but I don't recommend to do another one, but it's that effective, so you get my drift. And worst case scenario, if you had nothing else, even if you had about 70 grams of sugar from any beverage other than high fructose corn syrup, it would raise your sugar levels and go right back into your muscle cells to replenish it as well. So it's why recently you've seen companies like chocolate milk trending as a decent post-workout, or even people saying on Instagram or saying, you know, eat gummy bears or rice, even soda drinks, which I don't know. But listen, I'm just trying to teach better practices. There's always good, better, best practices, and it's just getting you into a smarter habit on what can speed recovery the best. And doing any of these is much better than not doing anything at all. So if the workouts aren't that intense, let's just say you went out for a casual hike, maybe about a 30-minute jog around your neighborhood. Again, it's about good, smartest practices. A simple solution would be just to take a good protein supplement. Again, preferably isolate protein, for example, with a little bit of carbohydrates so that it goes right back into the muscle cells for recovery. And about 30 minutes later, you know, have a normal healthy meal and go about the rest of your day. Okay? So our new delicious Max Gourmet Elite protein would do just fine. And you can also use this as a great meal replacement. So it's pretty versatile stuff. And, oh, did I mention we use real Oreo cookies for that? So it's really good. Best tasting meal replacement ever. So now keep in mind, when you drink the post-workout, your blood sugar levels will skyrocket, right? And stores everything into your muscle cells, and about 20-30 minutes later, your blood sugar levels will start to crash, and therefore you might start to feel a little clammy or you're a little shaky. That's called hypoglycemia. So it's really important that you need to eat a healthy and balanced meal, like, for example, a piece of chicken with brown rice or a little lean steak with some veggies within an hour or two, and then continue about your day, okay? So, and do you consider a post-workout shake as part of your meal? And the answer is no. Unless you're doing a bodybuilding show, then, you know, usually I count everything about 4 to 6 weeks out. And that's the rare exception. So, okay, moving forward. So I was talking about insulin and post-workout. Since I've been talking about carbohydrates after a workout to spike insulin levels, I want to talk a little bit more on the importance and potential dangers of insulin. Okay, insulin, as I was mentioning earlier, is said to be the fat-producing hormone, but it's also one of the biggest and best known to man anabolic hormones. And anabolic just means to build up, recover. And its role is to shove all the nutrients back into your muscle cells, causing, you know, cell volumization, right? But here's the negative part. So back in the 1990s, when I was in bodybuilding, bodybuilders found how using insulin dramatically increased more muscle gains in a short amount of time. And there were no new steroids, no growth hormones, but now they were getting about 50, 70 pounds bigger than their competitors, and that's because of insulin. But there's two dangers using insulin. Let's just say after an intense workout, you'll first take your insulin shot, right? You wait a few minutes, take your post-workout drink, that's loaded with carbohydrates to spike insulin. But if you accidentally spill your post-workout drink, you'll die. That's hypoglycemia to the intense degree, and that's a severe blood sugar crash. And also, insulin is also known to harden your arteries. So if you keep using this repeatedly, you're going to end up with hard arteries. I mean, we know that type 1 diabetics use insulin all the time, their entire lives. So one of the problems that they have is hardening of the arteries. I mean, you can have a high-fat diet and have perfectly clean arteries, but when you start throwing high amounts of carbohydrates in there and you're spiking your insulin each and every day, that causes plaque to stick to your arteries, okay? So by using insulin, you're really messing with fire, and it's something, you know, I don't recommend, or I'm sure all the physicians and doctors don't recommend at all. So nonetheless, if you can manipulate naturally your own body's insulin and make enough to shove all this back into your muscle cells like I just talked about earlier, as I explained, you're perfectly okay, all right? So just one last touch on insulin. So I just mentioned type 1 diabetes, so I might as well do a little explanation on what it is. If you have someone you know, or maybe yourself debating if you're a candidate for diabetes, I'll give you a little brief rundown. Diabetes, there's two. So first we have the type 1 diabetics, and for some reason they can't produce any insulin whatsoever. They have to take a shot of insulin, or they have this little pump that looks like a little pager, and every time they eat, they have to give themselves a little shot of insulin. Type 2 diabetics, there's different things that can happen. For example, you make insulin, but you don't make enough, or the insulin that you make isn't designed correctly, so it's kind of like going to your home and opening up your front door with your back door key. It's not really going to work really well. Or the people get so fat that these receptors are plugged with fat. So even though they can make insulin, they can't make it in there. So over the years and years of eating carbs and sugar, what happens is your blood is always thick all the time. And the way that cells get blood to them is kind of like a big hose, like an artery, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller, and it travels farther away from the heart, and they become what is called capillaries. And capillaries come from the Latin word hair. So boom, boom, hair, all right? So these little hair-like structures get brittle, and they end up breaking due to high sugar levels. So blood doesn't reach your legs. And that's why if type 2 diabetics don't take care of themselves, they can have their leg amputated. So if your sugar levels are way too high, what happens is that your kidneys will have to filter all that sugar. So they tend to have kidney damage. So the only part of the body that doesn't have these little receptors is our eyes. So our eyes don't have those receptors. So again, a lifestyle with high sugar, that sugar starts flooding your eyes and eventually damages them. So we know if you don't control your sugar levels, you can risk potentially ending up blind, no kidneys, and no legs. Not the coolest way to live life. So parents, don't reward your kids with fast food and sugar-laced foods and desserts. There's always better alternatives, because at that vulnerable age, you're just linking your child again with love and affection. So find healthier foods, like, you know, different rewards, like buying a new outfit, a new baseball glove, a new skateboard, even a new cool backpack for school again, okay? So a quick recap. So you eat carbohydrates, your sugar levels drop, the body secretes insulin, stores everything in the form of a glycogen, your pulls water in, blood sugars drop. The whole idea is to keep your sugar levels between 80 and 120, okay? So if we want to control our glucose levels or blood sugar, what's the food that we have to control? Proteins, fats, or carbohydrates? Carbohydrates, okay? So, well, there's another one. Where'd my fat go? But it's called trans fats. But there's a different kind of fat. So studies show that when you consume fried foods, when you fry a fat at really high temperatures, it changes the molecular structure of the fat, and that too can also raise your sugar levels. So fried foods, I recommend to really be careful of, not just because of the high fat caloric and high fat amounts, but because it will raise your blood sugar levels. So just be conscious about this. So trans fat, carbs. This yogurt has 33 grams of carbohydrates. This Cheerios has 25, and this other one 60, an English muffin 31, a plate of pasta can be 100. So what's a serving? Confused? So the American Diabetes Association did a study and asked about 2,800 type 1 diabetics, people that don't make any insulin, if they can measure how much sugar they had in their blood and start giving them carbohydrates. And how much do we have to give them to notice an increase in sugar levels? And it turns out that it took exactly 15 grams of carbohydrates to raise their sugar levels a noticeable amount. So the American Diabetes Association and the American Dietetic Association said, great, we should just make 15 grams a serving, okay? But if we notice the word serving, it has already been used. So they came out with a different name and decided to call them exchanges. So if you see a bagel that has 60 grams of carbohydrates, it's one serving, but it's 4 exchanges. So if you divide 60 by 15, you get 4. An English muffin that's 30 grams in one serving, but has 2 exchanges. A piece of bread has about this size would be about 15 grams for one exchange. And that's really cool to read labels because you could be thinking you're getting about 15 grams in a slice of bread. Here's a bread called Milton's bread that one slice has 29 grams of carbohydrates. There's another brand that says it's 11. So 15 grams would be one serving or one exchange. And that's how we look at it because that's what it takes for your sugar levels to go up a noticeable amount. Okay, and if you're using insulin, 1 unit usually neutralizes or puts away 15 grams of carbohydrates. If you're ever known a type 1 diabetic, some may use those glucose tablets, and how many grams of sugar do you think they are? 15. So in case your sugar levels drop, they take glucose tablets, wait a few minutes and see if it goes up, and then they take it again and so on until it gets normal. So even though carbohydrates are really important and that's what controls your sugar levels, we also know to a certain extent there's calories in and calories out. But let's say I need 2,500 calories a day just to maintain my weight, energy, and strength. If I had 2,500 calories a day from Crisco, or 2,500 from Pop-Tarts, or 2,500 from chicken, or from oatmeal, don't you think you'll get different results? Yeah, so it's not so much calories in, calories out, it's what are those calories really comprised of. I mean, yeah, I do take calories into account, but also where do they come from is really what's important. And because calories are important, we wanted to know what an exchange of fat and an exchange of protein was as well. So again, the studies done showed 5 grams of fat, okay, and 7 grams of protein, okay, is like 1 ounce that ran summer flu is an exchange. So for those of you who are cooking and measuring your foods at home, what happens to rice after you cook it? It triples. How about oatmeal? It doubles. Proteins like chicken and fish and steak, they shrink. So everything on the exchange list is measured after it's cooked. So let me show you an exchange list. So looking at carbohydrates, there's so many carbohydrates, we've broken down into subcategories. So one category is called the starches and breads. And as you notice, 15 grams of carbohydrates is one exchange. Now, how do we make bread? Well, we add some milk, we add some eggs, a little bit of fat. So there's about 3 grams of protein, 1 gram of fat, and it's about 80 calories. And that's just a generalization. So we're just going in general, a carbohydrate exchange or serving is 15 grams of carbohydrates, a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein. So if we look at rice, 1/3 cup is an exchange. If you look at potatoes, it's a 3-ounce baked potato. It's like the size of a computer mouse. And when I work on customized meal plans with my clients, I help to figure out how many exchanges you need for breakfast, morning snack, lunch, midday snack, dinner, PM snack, and so on. And how many of those you heard that you shouldn't eat after 6 p.m. Well, if I just said you should be eating every 3-4 hours, what happens is your dinner is at 6 and you're up till midnight. Do you have to starve for 2 hours? It's really not true. I have clients, and including myself, that I eat a pretty large size meal before bed because while you're sleeping, that's when your body is repairing itself, and that's when you need those nutrients. We say don't eat anything after 6 because what do most people do that are into fitness tend to do after 6? Yeah, they eat cookies, desserts, potato chips and other junk foods. So yeah, of course, avoid that. However, when you have quality foods like a good lean protein, like some brown rice, chicken or steak and so on, it's totally okay. Fruit, that would be a carbohydrate. 15 grams would be a serving exchange. So if you like, for example, bananas, half a banana that's 9 inches long would be an exchange. If you like watermelon, 1 cup and 1/4 will be an exchange. Now remember, what determines how long food stays in your stomach or gastric emptying time is how long it takes it for it to become a liquid and leave your stomach. So if we were to look at fruit juice will leave your stomach right away and it causes your blood sugars to skyrocket, right? And it goes so far up in your body, ends up turning it into something called triglycerides. And triglycerides is just another way of saying fat floating in your blood. And we know that if your triglycerides are greater than 100, that doubles your chances of a heart attack. And remember, insulin, our friend, well, one of the problems with fruit juice is fruit has this natural sugar called fructose, and fructose tends to raise your sugar levels, but it does not cause an insulin secretion. So what that means is that when fructose hangs around in your blood, it ends up binding to hemoglobin. And when you want to go see how you want to see your sugar levels, how good your sugar levels are, if you had a blood glucose meter right now, that machine will poke your finger and it'll tell you what your blood sugar levels are right now. So when diabetic patients that aren't really being careful, they control it for a day before they go see their doctor and say, hey, see how good I am? It's between 120 and 80 or 90. Well, the doctor or dietitian will take their blood and measure something called hemoglobin A1C, and it tells the doctor that the red blood cell has about a 90 to 120 day lifespan. So since all this excess sugar has bound to their blood cells in the form of hemoglobin, when they measure hemoglobin A1C, the doctor will know how good they've been the past 90 to 100 days. So hemoglobin A1C is one of the tools that doctors can use to diagnose whether to see if you have type 2 diabetes. And fructose, or fruit sugar, is a leading cause of diabetes in children. So remember how you had type 1 and type 2? Well, in type 1 diabetics where you don't make any insulin, and used to be called juvenile diabetes, and that usually meant that you got a virus or something happened that attacked your pancreas, which caused you to stop making insulin. So now that you have to take insulin shots, now it would take you a lifetime to get so fat that you would plug your receptors with fat and trash your pancreas, so you'll be an adult by then. So what's called type 2 diabetes or adult onset diabetes, but it's changed. Now we have these 8-year-old kids getting so fat too that they have type 2 diabetes, so they're not adults, so we can't call them adult diabetes anymore. And the reason, the leading cause for children's diabetes is because of fruit juice. So parents, when you thought fruit juice is good for your kids, you should rethink this again and reconsider. Fruit juice and the other drinks that have high fructose corn syrup, and mostly fruity drinks have high fructose corn syrup, it may even say they're natural, it doesn't mean it's healthy. So please, no fruit juices. So again, we like to avoid fruit juices because of their high fructose content, okay? And remember that rule, if it has a face, it's a protein. Well, there's a couple of exceptions. Milk, buttermilk, and yogurt, they come from cows, and cows have faces, but these are not considered proteins. If you look at a cup of milk, it has 12 grams of carbohydrates and only about 8 grams of protein. And there's a little bit of fat. When it comes to exchanges, we have to go with what does the food have the most of, okay? So if you look at nuts, they have protein and they also have fat, but they're also mostly fat, so we consider them fat. The same is true with milk. They have mostly carbohydrates, and even though there's some protein in there, we consider milk a carbohydrate. And again, talking to the parents, if you have kids and if they're under the age of 2, I recommend having them take whole milk. Once they're older than 2, I recommend to stop using whole milk and go to using skim milk or 1%. Skim milk is non-fat milk, potato. Okay, so the next on the carbohydrate list is vegetables. And kids, vegetables are really cool. When I talk about vegetables, 1 cup of raw vegetables is an exchange, or a half cup of cooked steamed vegetables. But in reality, if you want to eat a whole cabbage or an entire casserole mixed bagged steamed vegetables, I really don't care, especially the vegetables that are called cruciferous. A cruciferous vegetable looks like a crucifix, right? It's a cross. So if you broke open a broccoli or a stem or a cauliflower head, inside you'll see a little cross, and you want them because of their high fiber content. And fiber is good because it helps to slow down gastric emptying time, helping you to control your sugar levels a lot better. So if you're overweight or have type 2 diabetes, including these types of veggies in your meals would be paramount to stave off hunger and help trick your brain in feeling satiated or full after your meals. Still on the topic of vegetables, I've happened to work with vegetarians, and the challenge with people who work out a lot and rely mainly on proteins, vegetables, Vegetable protein is not as high quality as animal protein. If we look at protein, imagine a brick wall and each brick being an amino acid. The mortar or what holds the protein together is called bonds. Vegetable proteins have certain bonds, and there's tertiary bonds and there's quaternary bonds. The bonds that hold vegetable proteins together require a specific enzyme to be broken down. And as humans, we don't have those enzymes. We don't have 7 stomachs to be able to break down those things like cattle do. If we did, we probably wouldn't even need to be concerned about body fat percentages. So even though there's protein in beans and protein in vegetables, the amount that's in there isn't readily available for us to absorb. And more studies, for example, when you eat beans or vegetables that give you gas sometime after, it's not much from the fiber, but it's from the undigested protein. Because when we eat protein, again, it first goes to our stomach, then to our intestines, and when it gets to your colon, there's bacteria there that possesses those enzymes to break down those bonds. When those bonds break down, it's hard to digest those proteins, and it creates gas, bloating, and some discomfort. And that's one of the ways when you take a protein, whether it's food or a shake, this is a good indicator. If it's a good quality protein, your stomach will never lie to you, okay? So that's a good little tip for you. Earlier I mentioned something about the glycemic index, and so let me go ahead and explain how they came out with the glycemic index. So during a study, they gave 50 grams of pure glucose sugar to a group of people, and they measured their sugar levels and noticed that each person's sugar levels went up, and then they eventually came down. And then they said, okay, we're going to call this area A. And then they took 50 grams of another carbohydrate, and they noticed their sugar levels went up and came back down again, and they said this is area B. And then what they did is they divided B by A, and they came out with a number, and that number was your glycemic index. So all they're doing is comparing how much 50 grams of oatmeal, for example, raises my sugar levels compared to 50 grams of just pure glucose sugar, or how much 50 grams of bread or 50 grams of pure glucose. But the thing is, how many people eat 50-gram increments of oatmeal or potatoes or carrots? Nobody. But how about when we found out that if you combine 50 grams of oatmeal with another protein, like egg whites, for example, it's going to change gastric emptying time, changing the curve, rendering the glycemic index useless. So glycemic index is very useful if you're eating that food just by itself in 50-gram increments. So instead of using the glycemic index, my final rule to finish off my 4 rules of weight loss and building or maintaining muscle is called the 20% rule. And the 20% rule is avoid anything where sugar is more than 20% of the total number of carbohydrates. Okay, for example, let's take, for example, Cheerios, that it has 13 grams of carbohydrates, and now we look to figure out 20% of 13 is 2.6, so it has less than 2.6 because it has 1, which is fine. Take another look at another Cheerios, Honey Nut Cheerios, it says it has 25 grams, right? And it has 11. Remember, it's supposed to be, it's not a good choice. So some products may not have any labels, so you're just going to use to have common sense. So that's 20% rule. For those of you that have kids, go home and look at your cereals. You'll be amazed that none of them follow the 20% rule. And speaking of kids, soy milk always fails the 20% rule. Soy is an estrogen mimicker. So if you have a little boy and you give him estrogen-inducing foods and drinks, he's going to end up with little girl parts. Not a good way to go through middle and high school. But if you have a little girl and you give her frequent amounts of soy, she'll end up with bigger parts, and she probably doesn't want that early in life as well. And when it comes to the way we absorb soy protein, these intestinal cells have these receptors also, right? And there's 2 ways to absorb protein. One is called active diffusion, and the other one is called passive diffusion. When a little amino acid is going down your intestines, passive diffusion just means you can just sneak that amino acid right in there without a problem. Active diffusion, which is soy, means that the amino acid binds to a receptor, right? And the receptor pulls it in. When they make soy isolates, what happens is they bind to an essential amino acid to a non-essential amino acid, causing the little amino acid that binds to that receptor to have a big chunk on it. So it's about huge. So when that receptor pulls it in, okay, it creates tears or perforations, which means piercings, like irritable bowel syndrome or in all sorts of other stomach problems. There's like 73 different research articles showing the dangers of using soy in general. So when I look at a protein bar or a protein powder that contains soy isolates, personally, I avoid them, and I recommend so should you. The only receptors that men have for estrogen is right here, right? So if a man starts feeling tenderness around the nipple region, they could end up having the problem from soy. And there's many athletes to get that also get that. But when we look at hormones, we start with cholesterol, and our body changes some of the bonds in our cholesterol and makes it into testosterone. And then you change that one bond over and testosterone becomes estrogen. So if you make too much testosterone as an athlete or somebody that's exercising, you're male, it could aromatize, or what they call converted, and become estrogen. And that's how guys end up with gynecomastia, which is male breast development or man boobs. Okay, so the other way that happens is people that take too much testosterone, like pro bodybuilders or somebody that's trying to enhance their physique, it aromatizes and becomes estrogen and ends up with gynecomastia again. Perhaps that's okay because that guy knew beforehand it's directly from a drug he's using, but why give your little kid soy and have them go through childhood with all these problems? That's my point. So if the kids have an allergy to milk, it's usually either because of lactose intolerance, so which means they can't digest sugar inside milk called lactase. So you can either drink something like Lactaid, which means milk that's already been pre-digested, so that the sugars are no problem, or if they are completely allergic to milk, they can use almond milk or rice milk. They're safe and they're good alternatives. Anything you want but soy. Soy is horrible. Sorry. Meat and meat substitutes. And just like carbohydrates have different categories, we have 4 categories for meats. We have very lean meats, medium fats, and high fat meats. As I mentioned over here, 7 grams of protein is one exchange, and that's what you'd find in 1 ounce of meat. So if you look at the exchange list, they're all basically 1 ounce, 1 ounce, 1 ounce. Now, as the name implies, a high fat meat is high in fat. It has 8 grams of fat to 7 grams of protein. Things like pork, sausage, and Swiss cheese and other high fat items, I'd like you to avoid those. Medium fat meats have 5 grams of fat per ounce, and that's some cheeses, chicken, turkey, dark meat with skin, whole eggs. If you look at an egg has 7 grams of protein. 3.5 are in the yolk and 3.5 are in the white. And the yolk is 6 grams of fat, so the egg falls into medium fat meats. The ones that I like to have you eat most often are these 2 right here, very lean meats and lean meats. Very lean meats have 0 to 1 gram of fat per ounce. That would be turkey breast, chicken breast, tuna and water, low-fat cottage cheese, non-fat cottage cheese, egg whites, and so on. Lean meats have 3 grams of fat per ounce. That would be filet mignon, salmon, Parmesan cheese, so you can still eat normal foods. When it comes to fats, 5 grams of fats is an exchange. We also have 3 categories: monosaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats. Out of those 3, I like you to avoid saturated fats with one exception, something called MCT, medium chain triglycerides. When we look at fats, fats are characterized based on how many carbon chains they have. A medium chain triglyceride has 9 carbons. What happens when you consume MCTs, it goes to your stomach and then it goes to your intestines and it gets absorbed right into the bloodstream for energy. So you cannot store MCTs as fat. If you consume olive oil, for example, which is another fat good for you, however, it would get stored as fat if you take too much of it. And looking at fats, if we look at an avocado that is about 4 inches across, that's about the size of this baked potato here. If you take 1/8 of an avocado, that gives you 45 calories and 5 grams of fat. So if you were able to eat the entire avocado, that's 360 calories and 40 grams of fat. 6 almonds will give you 45 calories. I have a pretty big hand and I can grab a handful of almonds, and even though they're good for me and they're all natural and they're a good source of fat, that's a boatload of calories. So we like to eat those fats, but we like to eat them in moderation and eat the right ones, okay? Free foods. When it comes to free foods, this list right here is pretty cool because we have vegetables such as celery, cilantro, cucumbers, onions, peppers, radishes, salsa. You can eat as many of those you like, and there's absolutely no limit. So when people say they're going to lunch and I'm going to have a salad, Well, cool, but it's not going to give you any carbs for energy. It's not giving you any protein. It's just filling you up because salad is mostly made up of water. So your sugar levels will still be low. And if something has 20 calories, like a teaspoon of sugar-free jelly or jam, or maybe a tablespoon of ketchup or some low-calorie salad dressing 3 times a day, it's totally fine with me. Okay. So another question is the choice between eating real solid foods or having liquid shakes throughout the day. Speaking of burning calories, if you had the choice for the entire day, or you can use meal shakes or meals, I mean, I like using the shakes only if you have the choice of skipping the meals or having a shake. By all means, have a shake. I mean, but when you eat food, your body has to work and break down the food, which burns more calories. So when you drink something, your body doesn't have to work as hard. The whole idea is making your body work. How I determine how much water you should be consuming, we need 1 cc or 1 cubic centimeter of water per calorie. So when I create meal plans, this also tells me my client minimum and maximum of how much water they should be drinking. So there's 30 cc's in 1 ounce. So if you take your total caloric intake and divide it by 30, that tells you how many ounces your body will need. So if you're, for example, on a 3,000 calorie meal plan, divided by 30, you'll get 100 ounces. A gallon of water, like those milk cartons, is about 128 ounces. So a gallon would be kind of like your marker. And here's a fun fact about water. You don't have to do this to the extent. Should you drink cold water or hot water? Well, body temperature is 98.6 degrees and ice water is 32 degrees. So if you drink ice water, your body has to heat it up to 98.6 degrees. For every gallon of water, of ice water that you drink, you burn about 150 calories. So for someone doing all this cardio and is looking to lose more weight, drinking ice water will actually help you burn more calories. Again, this whole idea is to get your body to work, just like eating real food for your meals instead of shakes, like the example I just gave. So when I used to do meal plans for people who competed, when it gets closer to their show, I would take their shakes out of their meal plan because shakes are already pre-digested, so they don't really have to do anything or work harder. And if I give them chicken or steak, they have to go through the process of digestion, which burns more calories, and they're already at a deficit. So once they get about 5% of body fat or lower than 5%, every pound of fat that you lose afterwards, you tend to lose 1 pound of muscle. So in the off season, when I work with people who competed in bodybuilding shows, I made sure to help them pack on as much muscle at first and then maintain it while we working on getting rid of the fat. Okay, so I still see people today that consume very little to zero carbohydrates a day, and they go about their usual everyday routine. Is this sustainable? No. The reason why people lose so much weight when they go cut out their carbohydrates from their diets, like that Atkins diet, it was really popular about 10, 15 years ago, and it still kind of lingers still today. Well, in the induction phase, which is the beginning of the diet, you cut out all carbohydrates. So when you cut out all carbohydrates, you drain all your body of the glycogen, right? And all the water that was inside, and people can lose around 10, 15, 20 pounds of water, seriously. And they go into this something called ketosis. Ketosis is where you burn fat inefficiently, so you tend to burn more fat. And that's okay, but again, your brain needs about 100 grams of carbs just a day just to be able to think clearly. So when people drop it under 100 grams, I mean, you'll have trouble thinking and remembering things, and you become spacey and sometimes irritable. It's not a cool way to be living. But however, bodybuilders do this on purpose. I teach them because I teach them, obviously we have a plan and strategy, and we practice technique like weeks out before a show. So what happens is we drain out all the water and then we shove it back in with glucose and glycogen so they're full, and it gives more of a dramatic effect. So we'll choose a week, many months out from the show, and we deplete with carbs for 5 days, and then you'll start loading up for 2 days, and then you'll cut water out. So what happens, so what we're doing when you're loading, you're shoving all this glycogen back in your muscle cells, And when you stop drinking water, all that water between your skin and your muscles gets sucked into those muscles, and you look ripped and shredded and full of muscle, right? But if you eat too many carbs, you spill over, what they call it, and you look smooth on stage. If you didn't eat enough, you look flat, okay? However, the other dangerous problem is if you're not a bodybuilder, you're just doing this because you're overweight, and this especially happens to the people who are obese. And remember, they got to being obese from overeating for many years, so it's certainly a psychological trait. You can't get to be 300 pounds by eating normal. So they go on this Atkins diet where they cut out all their carbs, and they do this for about 3 weeks. By the 4th week, they're looking at that chocolate, cake, or pizza with love and affection, and eventually they're going to say, you know what, forget this. I can't resist this no longer, and they're going to end up eating the whole cake or pizza eventually. So they eat the whole pizza with all those carbs, and what happens is their body will start to overcompensate, and instead of putting one molecule and 3 times the amount of glycogen, like I just mentioned earlier, it still has to remain that ratio. So now it puts in 9 times, okay, the amount of water in the cell. So the muscle cells will get bigger and bigger until they can't hold water anymore, and they'll actually tear, and water spills over. When water spills over, it's called third spacing. Name a muscle in your body that cannot afford water and tears in it. Your heart. And that's why people that were on the Atkins diet, they go on this high amounts of carbohydrates, and possibly they died. And you know, there were cases that people died of a heart attack. So if you're going to do this, you need to make sure to be coached to slowly increase carbs back into your diet. My advice would be to add about 25 grams of carbohydrates a week. So they go from 0 carbs to the next week, add 25, and then the second week, add another 25. So you got a total of 50, and the third week will be 75, and reassess to see how they're feeling, and then maybe go back up to 100. And this is safe. However, bodybuilders do this on purpose because they know what they're doing, and most of the time know how much exactly they need.